Hello, Bob Reedfeld here, preaching and teaching minister of the Spring Hill Christian Church of Royal Oak, Lockney, Georgia. And welcome to another lesson in studying Bible prophecy as it relates to the second coming of Christ, or eschatology, study of the end times. Last time we talked about Daniel chapter 10 through 12, and today we're going to start talking about Zechariah chapters 9 through 14. Zechariah chapters 9 through 14. And so there's a lot of information that we're going to cover today. And so we're going to go ahead and get right into it. A little bit of a historical background. Cyrus issued a decree about 536 BC that the Jews could return to the Holy Land and rebuild the temple. You can find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Verse 22 and 23, as well as in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. With high purpose, many exiles returned, determined to resettle the land and to restore the temple. Early in the work, the Samaritans ended or denied any participation in the building or the rebuilding. They opposed the project, and we can read that in Ezra chapter 4, verse 5. The desolation of Jerusalem and the opposition of enemies discouraged the returned exiles, and the work of rebuilding the temple stopped. For almost 14 years, no more work was done on the project. About 521 BC, Darius Hystaspes came to the Persian throne, and both the prophets Haggai and Zechariah began to urge the people to take up again the task of rebuilding the temple. You can find that in Ezra chapter 5:1 and 6:14. Haggai appeared first and charged the Jews with neglecting God's house. Haggai 1:1. About 2 months later, Zechariah appeared with his first message, and that's in Zechariah 1:1. Zerubbabel and Joshua, the governor and high priest respectively, led in rebuilding the temple. The people responded, and the rebuilding of the temple was completed in 516 BC. The city itself will not be rebuilt until in the 400s BC, as we read about it in Daniel and Ezra and so on. Some difficulties for the interpreter. Zechariah is acknowledged by all schools of eschatology to be the most difficult of the Old Testament prophets, and perhaps chapter 14 is the most difficult of all. Chapters 1 through 6 deals with the rebuilding of the temple in Zechariah's time, while chapters 7 and 8 answer questions about fasting. Do the people still have to go on fasting and mourning as they did during the exiles when Jerusalem was in ruins? Chapters 9 through 14 contain two burdens or threatening predictions. Premillennialists have been accustomed to finding many of the details in their scheme of things in the verses of Zechariah. For example, Zechariah 1:17 is said to contain evidence that during the millennium, Jerusalem would again be God's choice for a capital city. 2:5 is supposed to show that the Shekinah glory will be visible in the millennium. Jerusalem would again be God's choice. It would be visible in the millennium Jerusalem. 2:8 is said to tell how the nations who had oppressed Israel would be punished after the Shekinah returns. 2:11 is supposed to show that the people will be converted during the millennium. Premillennialists think of 3:9 as the removal of Israel's iniquity during the millennium, often speaking of it as being done in a way different than through obedient faith, as was necessary in the church age. Just as Joshua and his companions were cleansed So Messiah is pictured as miraculously cleansing Israel during the millennial age. Chapters 5, verses 5 through 11 is supposed to suggest a restriction of the spirit of lawlessness during millennial prosperity. Chapter 6, verses 12 and 13 are said to speak of the rebuilt temple during the millennium. 6:15 shows that Gentiles will help in the rebuilding work. Chapter 8, verse 3 speaks of a return to the land of Palestine that the premillennialists expect to happen about the time of the second coming of Christ. They also find that the return of the Jews to Palestine can be found in chapter 10, verses 9 and following. Premillennialists see Antichrist in 11:16 as he turns against the Jews and perpetrates atrocities on hapless Israel. Premillennialists also tend to understand the final burden, Zechariah chapters 12 through 14, as being full of vital prophetic truth concerning what will happen to Israel just before the second coming of Jesus Christ. Israel will be attacked by many nations, only to be delivered by the returning Lord. Chapter 12:10 is made a reference to the second coming and is supposed to explain how the believing Jews are converted to Jesus. Chapter 14 then pictures all the nations gathered against Israel in a final world battle, and it tells how in his second coming, Jesus will stand literally on the Mount of Olives, causing it to split in two, forming a valley for the people of God to flee through. Millennial geography similar to Ezekiel's, the premillennialist believes is to be found in the remaining verses of chapter 14, as well as a description of restored Jewish worship during the millennium. The Bible student who has not studied the book of Zechariah in detail will find himself hard put to answer the premillennial method of interpretation. And will also find it difficult to give a satisfactory explanation of the verses that I just alluded to. The attempt to keep these comments brief precludes any detailed refutation of premillennialism handling here, but still a brief outline I want to give of Zechariah's argument that may prove to be helpful, especially should we see how explanations of many of Zechariah's verses by the New Testament writers help us to keep our bearings as we work through Zechariah's burdens. In the first 8 chapters, the Bible student should remember that the topic is the return from the Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple. The Shekinah did not return and settle on the rebuilt temple. Haggai chapter 2:9. Those nations who had been God's tools in the punishment of Israel were indeed judged and punished. The branch is none other than Jesus. And the passages speak of his first coming. So let's take a look at the first burden that can be found in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 1 to chapter 11, verse 17. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 8, the victories of Alexander the Great are predicted as Zechariah sees ahead to the conquest of Alexander in the 4th century BC. Tyre's power in the sea, the island part of the city, was to be smitten, verse 4, and Alexander did it. He caused fear in Philistia, and Jerusalem was not devastated, though Alexander passed through. Verse 8, Alexander repeopled conquered areas with foreigners. Verse 6. Verses 9 and 10, we have the Messiah's reign of peace. Messiah will be much different from Alexander the Great. Christ's triumphal entry on a colt the foal of a donkey is predicted. Just compare it with Matthew chapter 21, verse 5. Messiah speaks peace to the Gentiles, verse 10. And note the use of the word Ephraim in this passage. Also look in chapter 9, verse 13 and chapter 10, verse 7, as denoting the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. Messiah's kingdom stretches to the end of the earth. And so then in chapter 9, verses 11 through 17, we have the victories of the Maccabees. First, there's a call to those still in Babylon in Zechariah's time to come home. Then it's predicted that the Jews will be successful against Antiochus Epiphanes, the Grecian ruler of Syria. God would fight for Israel, and great blessings are promised to Israel after that. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 12, blessings during the intertestamental period between the Old and the New Testament. People are to pray for the rain that would produce the promised blessings. Israel did give up her idol worship after captivity, but continue to have problems with false prophets and spiritists. You can look in Nehemiah 6:10 and following, as well as Malachi 3:5, to find that to be true. Because their appointed leaders failed them, God himself was to become their shepherd, their cornerstone, their tent peg, and their battle bow. All are messianic designations. Ephraim, the northern kingdom, also experiences these blessings coming from Messiah being their shepherd. Verses 6 and following. The decree for Ephraim to return had already come forth. Verse 8. Zechariah predicts a return from far countries. Verse 9. And there was a further return in Ezra's time, 458 BC, 20 plus years after Zechariah's last prediction. Some came from Assyria, verse 10, to which the northern kingdom had been captive. God removes obstacles so that Jews can return. Then we find in chapter 11, verses 1 through 17, the rejection of the Good Shepherd. The chapter seems to speak of the rejection of Jesus by the Jews and the consequences that befell the Jews because of that in AD 70, before the chapter is ended. The invasion from the north, when the pride of Judah is spoiled, may picture the Roman dominion of Palestine. Verses 1 through 4, the root cause of this catastrophe is revealed to be the misconduct of the people and the shepherds or rulers toward the great shepherd sent by God to feed the flock. In verses 7 and following, the prophet took two staves, one to call grace and the other bands or binders to help in his work of shepherding the flock. Grace speaks of the relationship of God, and band speaks of the Jews' relationship to each other. North and south were reunited. It's almost fruitless to attempt to identify the three shepherds. Verse 8, one writer has counted over 40 different interpretations. In spite of what the shepherd did, the sheep loathed the shepherd. Because the people rejected him, he broke his staff called grace. God broke the covenant he had made with nations in behalf of his people. As a result, the Jews were harassed by nations on every side at the close of the Maccabean period. Verses 12 and following. Jesus is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver and the money given to a potter in the sanctuary. Compare Matthew chapter 27, verse 10. Verses 14 and following, the Jewish nation was divided into contending factions, and it was done before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Verse 15 and following, the foolish shepherd is likely the Roman oppressor who destroyed the Jewish state and mercilessly hassled the Jews subsequent to their rejection of Christ. Here it is forecast of the ultimate downfall of the Roman oppressors who were tools in God's hands to punish Israel after their rejection of the Messiah. Note in passing, the premillennialists find several of their chief ideas in this first burden. In 10:19 and following, they find a return of Israel to the Holy Land at the close of the church age. In 11:16, they find a prediction of Antichrist and have him turning against the Jews and perpetrating atrocities on hapless Israel. Now let's take a look at the second burden, which is found in Zechariah chapter 12, 1 to chapter 14, verse 21. In the first 9 verses of chapter 12, hostile nations attack Jerusalem and are defeated. And since the next things falling brings us to Calvary, this paragraph undoubtedly has reference to the victorious contest during the Maccabean period. This burden deals with both Israel and Judah. In other words, all the tribes of Israel. Those attempting to prove a theory of eschatology based on 10 lost tribes of Israel have these passages in Zechariah against them. In those days, Jerusalem shall prove to all nations that attack it a weight not only too heavy to lift, but one which would wound and injure those who attempt to carry it. The feeble who win a victory reminds us of an aged Matthias who initiated the glorious Maccabean struggle. Verses 10 through 14 of chapter 12, an outpouring of God's grace results in repentance. After the enemies are overcome, God will return to spiritual matters that must be set right in Israel. John 19:36 and 37 tells us that Zechariah 12:10 has a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. And likely we should understand the following verses to refer to the times immediately after the crucifixion of Jesus. The mourning is likely a reference to the repentance of the Jews mourning over sin and turning to Christ after 30 AD. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 6, the land and the people are purified. Zechariah predicts that freedom from idolatry, which marked the post-exilic period of Jewish history, it seems that the opening words in that day should be referred to the same period spoken of in Zechariah 12, 3, 4, and 6. In other words, the intertestamental period. Further, the paragraph following has the reference to the first coming of Jesus. And for these two reasons, it would appear correct to explain the paragraph as I just said, a picture of the post-exilic period. Chapters 13, verses 7 through 9, the smitten shepherd and the remnant. Matthew 26:31 makes an application of these words of Zechariah to what happened to the disciples of Jesus at the time of Jesus' arrest, just before his crucifixion. Perhaps we are to see in the 1/3 the remnant idea that Paul builds upon in Romans chapter 9 through 11. Those who become converts to Christianity are the Israel of whom God says they are my people. Once the remnant recognizes God, he will recognize them as his people. Chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, the first part of verse 5, the day of the Lord. All interpreters recognize chapter 14 as the most difficult chapter in the book of Zechariah. This author and scholar as well. Most are able to interpret it to fit their preconceived scheme of eschatology, which they believe the Bible elsewhere teaches. The interpreters who think the day for the Lord is synonymous with day of the Lord, 2 Peter 3, make this chapter speak of the second coming of Jesus. Those who think the expressions are not synonymous make these verses speak of the judgment on Jerusalem in 70 AD, a day when God significantly manifested his glory. Many nations were represented in the invading Roman army, for Rome was the mistress of many lands in that time. The horrors attending to the capture of the city by Titus are predicted. And just as God came forth to help Israel in the days of the Old Testament battles, remember what happened at the Red Sea, so he would do it again, Zechariah predicts. Those who see a reference in these verses to 70 AD understand that verses 4 and 5a are a striking figure or symbol promising divine intervention to facilitate the escape of the favored remnant from the city. And indeed, in 70 AD, there was just such an escape to the east and across to the Jordan River to the city of Pella. For further details of the escape of the Christians to Pella, you can I can give you those if you request them from me. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in Matthew chapters, when we cover Matthew's chapters 24 and 25. Chapter 14, the second part of verse 5 through verse 15, it talks of the Messiah's holy kingdom. It appears that the subject has changed, and we've now moved from the day for the Lord to the time of the second coming. Perhaps this change from 70 AD to the time of the second coming is the reason why the prophet abruptly changes from the third person to the second person. The Hebrew reads, "And all the holy ones with you." The holy ones include the angels and saints. The New Testament tells us, Matthew 24, 30 and 31 and 25, 31. Verse 7 describes the kind of conditions that will prevail when the heavens are rolled up as a scroll and the light dwindles. And at the close of this unique day, at evening time, when usually darkness deepens, the light shall suddenly brighten, and instead of dusk shall come dawn. Is it possible then that the light from the New Jerusalem, which the next verse speaks of, is the thing that dispels the darkness? The language of verses 8 through 11 is similar of Revelation 21 and 22, and may well be a picture of how it will be when the New Jerusalem has come down out of heaven. In fact, verse 11 is repeated in Revelation 22, verse 3. Verses 12 and following may picture what happens to the wicked following the coming of the Lord. Chapter 14, verses 16 through 20, the worship and the spirituality of the new order. The verses seem to speak of the time after the judgment, when the nations of the new heavens and the new earth are going up to worship. The language used is figurative, and the particular feast mentioned, the Feast of Tabernacles, is the fittest of all Jewish festivals to illustrate the prophet's meaning. It was a time of grateful recollection, adoring praise, and joyful anticipation. And so will be the worship in heaven. The verse about families returning to worship is no more enigmatical than Revelation 22:2, which implies that some kind of illness is possible in the new state. Failure to join in the worship of the Lord of hosts would be punished, is what the prophet foresees. Zechariah closes with language that is to be understood as giving a picture of Jerusalem wholly consecrated to the Lord. Even the commonest of things shall have become holy. There is no literal temple in the new heavens and the new earth. Revelation 21:22, therefore we must understand Zechariah's language in a figurative sense when he speaks of the Lord's house. And the final verse reminds us of Revelation 21:27, which describes the dwellers in the New Jerusalem. There shall in no wise enter into it anything that defileth, neither whatsoever worketh abomination or maketh a lie, but they which are written in the Lamb's book of life. As one might expect, premillennialists find completely different things predicted than what we talked about. They think that the second burden is full of vital prophetic truth concerning what will happen to Israel just before the second coming. Israel will be attacked by many nations, according to them, only to be delivered by the returning Lord. They see 12:10 as a reference to the second coming, suggesting that the returning Jesus has the same marks on his body as he did when he was crucified. Furthermore, one often reads a comment like, restored to the land first, the Jews are now restored spiritually, indicating the belief that the Jews are converted to faith in Jesus as their Messiah, as they see him returning on the clouds of heaven at his revelation coming. Where we have spoken of the remnant, premillennialists speak of what happens to the Jews during the Great Tribulation. Premillennialists see chapter 14 as being a reference to the nations who will gather for the battle of Armageddon. This is followed by Jesus setting foot on earth on the Mount of Olives, followed by that mountain splitting into two. Since in the premillennial scheme of things, the millennium follows the revelation coming. They tend to compare the verses about Jerusalem with Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48, which they have labeled Ezekiel's millennial geography. They also find evidences for restored Jewish worship during the millennium in closing verses of chapter 14. This author, this writer, this scholar rejects the premillennial handling of Zechariah for several reasons, but mainly because he believes we should allow the applications of Zechariah's prophecies made in the New Testament books to guide us in finding our way through the Old Testament book. And this is exactly the course that we have attempted to follow, or I have attempted to follow in the explanations given for the various items included in the burdens. That's all we're going to talk about this evening or today. And next week we're going to start the final section. The final section of our study. It's going to be a long one, so don't worry. We're going to talk about prophecies about the church age before the little season. We're going to talk about Matthew chapters 24 and 25. You'll want to make sure next week that you stay tuned for that, because there's some vital information. A lot of people have misinterpreted those scriptures. Then we're going to talk about Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 10, and how it relates. Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, Romans chapter 11, and then Revelation 13. And then I'll give my closing thoughts and ideas and suggestions in a few studies about the second coming of Christ and the Bible prophecies surrounding it. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope that it has encouraged you and motivated you to dig further into the book of Zechariah and compare it with what we've talked to and the New Testament passages of Scripture that help to explain it. I hope you have a great rest of the week, and may God bless you.